Okay, welcome to webinar number 2, alcohol and its effects. So, once again, welcome to this webinar. Many teenagers consume alcohol without awareness of its contents. However, alcoholic beverages are quite risky substances to consume. So, why don't we know? Well, in this webinar, I'm going to discuss the different types of alcohols, as well as many different types of alcoholic beverages, and the health risks that these beverages pose, in addition to some solutions. But before we begin, who am I? I am Vinay Kalva, one of the co-founders of Live Well Teens. Live Well Teens is an organization founded by me and my friend and co-founder Ana Garau, intended to educate teenagers, parents, and others on teenage issues. Our website is at livewellteens.org. And about our webinars. We have 2 different types of webinars in order to accommodate differing learning styles. Right now, you're tuned in to the formal webinar. The casual webinar happened yesterday. So, I will cover the main idea and some key concepts, and then we'll move on. So, the main idea. Alcohol is addictive for teenagers, but can be dealt with in a positive manner. Some key concepts. So first we'll discuss alcoholic beverages that are actually just one type of alcohol, and the many different types of alcoholic beverages with their own proposed health effects. We'll also talk about the health consequences of acute and chronic alcohol consumption, and the gender difference in the effects of alcohol on different people. We'll finally discuss some techniques to deal with teenage alcohol consumption. So, a quick disclaimer, the information presented in this webinar is for educational purposes only and does not take precedence over the advice, guidance, and/or counseling of your primary care physician, pediatrician, or other medical specialist. So, without further ado, let's start learning. So, what is alcohol? Alcohols are, according to one professor at the University of Washington, quote unquote, a class of organic compounds characterized by one or more hydroxyl groups attached to a carbon atom. There are 3 different types of alcohols. Alcohols: primary, secondary, and tertiary. This table summarizes primary, secondary, and tertiary alcohols. So in a primary alcohol, the hydroxyl, or OH, attaches to a primary carbon. Some examples include ethanol, methanol, and isopropyl alcohol. These alcohols are primarily used in alcoholic drinks, as industrial solvents, and as rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. You'll find out which one is used in alcoholic drinks next. Secondary alcohols have the hydroxyl molecule, or OH, attaching to a secondary carbon. One example includes 1-butanol, which is a food additive and flavoring agent. And finally, tertiary alcohols. The hydroxyl molecule attaches to a tertiary carbon in a tertiary alcohol. And one example is 2-methyl-1-butanol, a flavoring agent. Not to be confused with 1-butanol. So, let's discuss ethanol in more depth. So, ethanol is the alcohol in alcoholic drinks. And just like every other alcohol, ethanol is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules. This diagram completely explains ethanol for you. So, the general chemical formula is C2H6O, but the more complex one is CH3CH2OH. As you can see in the legend, gray is carbon, white is hydrogen, and red is oxygen. So, the reason that ethanol is the primary alcohol is because the OH, the oxygen hydrogen, attaches to a primary carbon, a carbon that's attached to only one other carbon. And now we'll discuss why there are 2 different formulas. So the first one is just the number. So there are 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1 oxygen, the C2H6O. But the second formula describes the bonds in a little bit more detail. So CH3, carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. CH2, carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen. And OH, the oxygen and the hydrogen. And thanks to PubChem for providing this excellent diagram of ethanol. So, in summary, the first name is general, while the second name describes the bonds in more detail. And ethanol actually does have other uses other than being in your alcoholic drink. It is actually a bacteria killer and is used as a disinfectant. It is also found in many consumer products, and it is also a food additive in some foods. It is created from fermentation of sugar, natural sugars, which we will discuss next. So, as I said, fermentation. So, fermentation is an interesting process that many foods go through. Not just alcohol, bread, cheese, and some other commonly consumed foods are also fermented. So, this is how fermentation works. Bacteria and yeast convert sugars into ethanol and carbon dioxide. But for those of you more chemically minded, there's also the chemical equation way to describe it. C6H12O6 turns into 2C2H6O, that's ethanol, plus 2CO2, carbon dioxide. What about distillation? So not all alcoholic beverages are distilled. Only some are. These alcoholic beverages are distilled after fermentation. The alcohol is heated in a pot still, condensed, and collected, as you can see here. So, the alcohol is inside this pot still, heated by some heat source, say a stove fire, or just a fire in general. That is controlled. At some point, the alcohol will vaporize and become gas. The gas goes through this condenser, where it travels through this tube, and then it's cooled down back into a liquid in a receiver. Why people distill is to concentrate the amount of alcohol, because alcohol vaporizes very quickly. But other parts of alcoholic beverages that are still in the pot still don't vaporize so quickly. So the alcohol can go through the condenser and land in the receiver much faster than the remaining components. And by the way, most alcohol isn't distilled once. This can be done. Alcohol is often distilled many times in order to concentrate the alcohol as much as possible. But even so, alcoholic beverages are only part alcohol. So distillation increases the concentration of alcohol in your beverage. Now let's talk about the history of alcohol consumption, which is quite interesting. Alcohol was supposedly first discovered 100,000 years ago. But 70,000 years later, shamans, or religious people who try to connect to natural forces, were thought to first drink alcoholic beverages. Wine was first produced in China in 7000 BCE. Resinated wine, or wine containing tree resins, first was produced in Iran between 5400 and 5000 BC. Grape remains actually provide evidence of wine production in the 4000s BC. Wine and beer became luxury goods during that same time. Later, in the Common Era, alcohol became a trade good and was later commercially produced worldwide. Each culture had their own drinks. For example, the Romans and Greeks drank wine because grapes grew well in the tropical climate. For the same reason, Egyptians consumed beer, except this time, the grain produced well in the tropical climate. Japanese people consumed sake, a beverage made from rice, a staple food in many East and Southeast Asian countries. Now let's talk about different alcoholic drinks. Now there are far too many alcoholic drinks to cover in one webinar, but there are a few that I'll be covering: beers, wine, and spirits, the three most popular. So let's start with the undistilled drinks, beer and wine. So these drinks have a lower alcohol by volume. That is the percentage of alcohol the percentage of alcohol in proportion to the whole thing. So let's say that I have a liter of an alcoholic drink, and the alcohol by volume for the alcoholic drink is 5%. In that case, I would have 50 milliliters of ethanol in that big 1 liter vat. But so beer and wine have only been fermented, not distilled. So let's start with the beer. A survey of 1,000 people in June 2016 found beer is the #1 most consumed alcoholic beverage in the United States. Of the 1,000 people surveyed, 46.4% of those respondents regularly bought beer. These are the basic components, which according to German law are the only things that should be in beer. Water, hops, grain, and yeast. So the purpose of the grain is fermented by the yeast. So the yeast eat the sugars in the grain and form it into ethanol. Then hops is added to make the beer sour. And finally, after that, the mixture plus water forms beer. Now let's talk about health effects. There are actually people who claim that beer is beneficial for you, and they might be true. And those claims might be true. I'll be covering two claims today: the fact that beer is beneficial for the heart and for blood sugar control. But before any adolescents here decide that it's great that they can finally consume alcohol without any negative effects, they should make sure that they read this note. These studies have been conducted on specific adult populations only. There are very few studies on adolescents that show these benefits. So let's start with the 1996 paper in the BMJ, a highly respected journal. This systematic review of 12 ecological, 3 case control, and 10 prospective cohort studies found that for any drink, all these that many commonly consumed alcoholic beverages were beneficial for the heart. Of the prospective cohort studies that they examined, the researchers found 4 that were on beer, and all of these prospective cohort studies agreed that beer lowered heart disease risk. But for any drink, the paper found the effect was modest. So basically, you could say it is more beneficial for your heart to eat, say, a healthy diet maybe, than to drink beer. Well, another study of 36 overweight men and women found that drinking beer was associated with better HDL function in those with metabolic syndrome. However, as you can see, 36 overweight men and women is not a very large population. So this paper suggested that a larger population was needed to confirm these findings. The final paper that I read was a consensus statement saying that 1 drink a day for women and 2 for men may be beneficial for cardiovascular disease risk. But keep in mind that some of the authors of this consensus statement were funded by alcohol companies and alcohol company representation boards. So we don't know if this paper was accurately representing the evidence or the interests of alcohol companies. So what about the fact that beer is beneficial for blood sugar control? So there are studies on alcohol in general being beneficial for blood sugar control, but there are no studies specifically for beer. Although some alcoholic beverages may be beneficial, the article from which I got the 2 claims mentioned that the effect did not apply to beer. So again, these studies have been conducted on specific adult populations only. Now let's talk about wine. So wine is the second most popular alcoholic beverage after beer. Of the survey that I mentioned previously, 36.1% of respondents regularly bought wine. Here are the basic ingredients: grapes and yeast. So the yeast digests the sugar in the grapes and thus forms ethanol. Now let's talk about the health effects of wine. Some people probably know that wine is touted to be healthy for your heart. I'll be covering not only that claim, but 2 others. So I'll first talk about antioxidants, then inflammation, and then heart health. So let's start with antioxidants. There are very few studies that exist today on the topic. Let's start with a randomized controlled trial of 40 people, 20 young and 20 old, that found that red wine provides antioxidants. Another study of 15 people, which was placebo-controlled, found that wine did prevent oxidative stress, which is the main thing antioxidants protect against. And the authors said it was a small but strong study. But considering the fact that wine only worked in 40 and 15 people, doesn't necessarily represent the whole population in general. So I would say while this claim is true based on the evidence I reviewed, more studies are probably needed in the future in order to confirm this. Now, let's talk about inflammation. A study of 3 cross-sectional samples found moderate consumption of wine is, quote-unquote, from the paper, is associated with lower levels of systemic inflammatory markers. However, because this study was cross-sectional, we cannot determine whether or not drinking moderate consumption of wine is causing lower levels of systemic inflammatory markers. There might be confounding variables. say the fact that many moderate drinkers have otherwise healthy lifestyles, and these healthy lifestyles may be stopping inflammation itself. There was also the potential for selection bias. The second study that I evaluated was one of 2,900 women, which found women consuming wine in moderation had the lowest levels of inflammation. However, 31% of the women in the study dropped out before the final assessment. And because of the low number left, this may have skewed the results. The third study that I evaluated found wine did not reduce C-reactive protein, which was a cause of inflammation. 87 people were tested, and a significant correlation between wine consumption and no reduction of C-reactive protein was found. However, we are not sure if wine does cause C-reactive protein not to decrease. We still need more studies on that. So what I would say is, while wine may be beneficial for inflammation, based on what I have reviewed, I would say that it's more beneficial for adolescents and adults alike to eat a healthy diet, as mentioned before. Well, what about the benefits for heart health? Perhaps the most common claim made about wine. Well, moderate wine drinkers do have lower heart disease rates, and a review article published in the American Heart Association journal Circulation supports this, saying that drinking alcohol was associated with reduced risk of ischemic heart disease. However, the authors mention that people should focus on a healthy diet to reduce heart disease risk. So in conclusion, the next time that someone tells you that you should drink wine because it's beneficial for your heart, you should probably tell them that that people in the Mediterranean, which this claim is often based on, ate a very healthy diet that was low in processed foods and processed animal products. Now let's talk about distilled alcohol. So distilled alcohol is alcoholic beverages that have been both fermented and distilled. The alcohol has been heated at least once to concentrate the ethanol content. The ethanol levels in this type of alcohol are higher than in undistilled alcohol because of distillation. Perhaps the most famous example of distilled alcohol are spirits. So spirits are distilled alcoholic drinks with a high alcohol content. Here are some examples. So these are actually not how tequila, vodka, sake, gin, and rum look, because I don't know how they look. I just put the color of the plant that they're made of. For example, tequila and gin are made of blueberries, not blueberries, blueberries. Tequila is made from a light blue and gin from darker. Rum is made of sugarcane, which is green, and sake is made of rice, which is colored white. Vodka is made from potatoes, which are brown, so that's why the colors. But either way, these are still commonly consumed spirits that many people love to drink. As for health effects, I haven't done much research into this, but I can tell you that because there's a higher alcohol content in spirits, you may risk becoming drunk. I recommend that you follow the tips that will be outlined in the second half of the webinar. All right, so now that that's a lot of information, so I'm going to give you a 5-minute break. Take a drink, visit the restroom, do anything else you need, but please do not drink beer, wine, or spirits. I'll see you in 5 minutes. We're halfway through our break. Please make sure that you're ready within 5 minutes. Within 2.5 minutes. All right. I hope you enjoyed your break. We will continue with the webinar. Okay. So why is alcohol unsafe? Well, consuming alcoholic beverages comes with both short and long-term effects. So we'll discuss the acute, short-term, and chronic, long-term effects of drinking alcohol. So let's start with the acute effects of consuming alcohol, or acute alcohol consumption effects. So acute alcohol consumption has some severe symptoms within a short period after you drink. Let's start. So these are some of the acute alcohol consumption symptoms faced by adolescents who drink. Starting with accidents. For any adolescents who drive, adolescents under the influence may be at higher risk of accidents. There's also risk of overdose if one is drunk, and use of other drugs as well, due to acute alcohol consumption. In addition, the final effect is withdrawal and hangover. So we're going to discuss binge and heavy drinking and drunk driving. And after that, we'll discuss chronic problems. So let's start with binge and heavy drinking. The two terms seem similar, so many people get confused. So here's what heavy drinking and binge drinking are. So according to the CDC, binge drinking is when a woman drinks 4 drinks within 2 hours, or a man drinks 5 drinks within 2 hours. Heavy drinking, by comparison, is when a woman drinks 8 or more drinks per week, or a man drinks 15 or more drinks per week. Oh, and just a side note, binge drinking means also has a blood. If you are binge drinking, you should also have a blood alcohol content of above 0.08%. So, what is a blood alcohol level, or BA, or blood alcohol content? So, blood alcohol content (BAC) is the amount of blood in your bloodstream. This is expressed in milligrams per milliliters. In 49 out of 50 states, excluding Utah, and Washington, D.C., the legal limit is 0.08%. In Utah, it's 0.05%. For commercial drivers, the limit is 0.04%, half that of pretty much every state and D.C. But for anyone who's under the age of 21, they should not have any blood alcohol content. Let's talk about drunk driving. So, let's start off with a few basic statistics. 2.4 million times a month, a teen drinks or drives. 85% of drunk driving teens say they binge drink, and 20% of adolescent crashes involved a drunk adolescent. But here's some good news. The number of teenagers who drink and drive has fallen by more than half since 1991. But even so, 1 in 10 teenagers still drives drunk in the United States. And teenagers are 17 times more likely to die if they have a blood alcohol level of 0.08%, which is the legal limit in every state except Utah and in Washington, D.C. And drunk driving does not go unpunished. The legal consequences include being charged with a misdemeanor or felony offense, $10,000 or more in fines and legal fees for a first-time offense, and revocation of your driver's license. In addition, you may even be sent to jail time in some cases. It's easy to avoid this, though. You just don't need to drive drunk, and you can coordinate to allow anyone who may become drunk not to drive. So those are the acute consequences. Let's talk about chronic alcohol consumption, because alcohol consumption has long-term consequences as well as short-term. Teens who drink during adolescence are more likely to become dependent on alcohol as adults than those who wait. So we'll discuss 3 main chronic consequences. Consequences on brain communication, the circulatory system, and cancer consequences. So let's start with brain communication. So I'll be talking about some important parts of the brain, just so that the next section seems a little bit more understandable. So let's start with the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional processing and reward behavior. The striatum is part of decision making, and the frontal cortex is responsible for decision making and executing actions. Teenagers don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, which is the most important part of this frontal cortex. The hippocampus is responsible for memories based on knowledge and facts. So when you're listening to this webinar, all of the information that I'm telling you will be stored in your hippocampus. Then there's SN/VTA, which you'll find out the full name next. It's part of the midbrain, which is responsible for hearing and eye movement. So alcohol actually affects those brain parts. Let's start off with the neurons that are hacked by alcohol. So when you drink alcohol, what happens is some parts of alcohol of the alcohol hack into your neurons, like how a hacker hacks into a computer. Then it turns these neurons into little chaos robots. So they basically create chaos in your brain. So GABAergic neurons do the most damage. GABAergic and glutamatergic neurons increase pleasure-seeking behavior and decrease behavioral flexibility in the frontal cortex, which is dangerous considering the fact that teenagers don't have a fully developed one. In addition, these two neuron types decrease cognition and increase sensitivity to brain changes under the influence when they're controlled by alcohol. Dopaminergic neurons, which produce dopamine, and GABAergic neurons increase risk-taking behavior in the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental system. GABAergic neurons and CRF neurons cause anxiety in the amygdala. CRF neurons produce CRF, the neurotransmitter CRF, which attaches to CRF1 receptors. And then GABAergic neurons arrive at the amygdala and cause anxiety. GABAergic neurons alone increase pleasure-seeking behavior and make the striatum more sensitive to changes in the brain. I highly recommend that you read this paper. The link is in the source list. And no, these are the consequences for chronic alcohol consumption, not acute. Next, let's talk about the circulatory system problems. You will actually find there's a surprising section in this section. Well, a surprising part in this section. Let's start with alcoholic cardiomyopathy, which is defined as, quote unquote, according to one paper, cardiac dysfunction associated with excessive alcohol intake. The amount of alcohol you need to cause alcoholic cardiomyopathy is still not known, but it is considered as a leading cause of left ventricular dysfunction. The left ventricle is where blood is replenished with oxygen. So, if your left ventricle is not working properly, then that means your oxygen-deprived blood coming from other parts of your body are not being replenished with new oxygen, which is dangerous because you need oxygen for your body to function. Next, let's talk about cardiac arrhythmias, or irregular electric heart impulses. A paper in the European Heart Journal examined 3,028 Munich residents, and it found that acute alcohol consumption was associated with cardiac arrhythmias. This prospective study did not account for some confounding variables, but even so, acute alcohol consumption could increase your risk of these electric impulse problems. But according to a 1992 editorial in the BMJ, a 1992 editorial in the BMJ starts with, quote, heavy drinking increases the risk of cardiac arrhythmias, although this may only apply to heavy drinkers. Now, stroke. Now, before you leave this webinar thinking I'm crazy, you should understand that some stroke is caused by problems in the arteries in your brain. So, a meta-analysis of prospective studies concluded heavy drinking increased risk of all 3 stroke types, although 25 of 27 studies were on ischemic stroke. Light and moderate drinking decreased ischemic stroke risk, but heavy drinking increased it. An analysis of almost 600,000 drinkers published in The Lancet found alcohol consumption was roughly linearly associated with a higher risk of stroke. Of the almost 600,000 people, over 39,000 cases of cardiovascular disease were reported. The paper recommends that you cap your alcohol consumption at 100 grams per week to protect yourself from stroke mortality. The final effect we'll be discussing is blood pressure. A systematic review and meta-analysis in The Lancet Public Health, a different journal, found reducing alcohol intake lowers blood pressure. This meta-analysis analyzed 36 different trials, although few included women. However, despite this, the paper concluded that it is beneficial to cut down on alcohol. So that's what happens in your circulatory system when you consume alcohol. What about in your liver? So let's start off with steatosis, or fatty liver. If you drink too much, fat can develop in your liver. Although there are a few direct symptoms that you can see, no one coughs or sneezes or has any physical symptoms from getting a fatty liver, it is still extremely dangerous because it is the first stage in alcohol-related liver disease. The next stage in ARLD, alcohol-related liver disease, is alcoholic hepatitis, which is not to be confused with hepatitis B or hepatitis C. It is caused by long-term alcohol misuse, but is reversible if you stop drinking. The final stage in alcohol-related liver disease is liver cirrhosis, when the liver is scarred, and anyone continuing to drink is more than 50% likely to die within 5 years. So, in summary, alcohol-related liver disease starts at steatosis, fatty liver, then it becomes alcoholic hepatitis, and finally progresses to liver cirrhosis. Liver fibrosis is inflammation in the liver, causing injury and scarring. It may be why steatosis can progress to liver cirrhosis. Now let's discuss the final part, cancer. So a meta-analysis of 27 studies concluded for the first time that the relative risk of prostate cancer increased the more alcohol you consume. A lot of previous literature has said that drinking alcohol does not necessarily cause prostate cancer, but this was the first one to show it did. The meta-analysis found prostate cancer mortality increased at low volume alcohol consumption levels. So even if you were consuming a little bit of alcohol, you were still increasing your prostate cancer risk all the while. And the more alcohol you consume, the more your risk of prostate cancer jumped. A dose response. So, however, this meta-analysis had a quite small sample of 27 studies, which was quite hard to control. So it was quite hard to control for any confounding. But either way, it would still be good to avoid alcohol consumption. According to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, the following cancers, drinking alcohol increases your risk of head and neck cancer, esophageal cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer, and colorectal cancer. So let's start with head and neck cancer. So drinking alcohol does not raise your risk of all head and neck cancers. It increases the risk of some, though. People consuming more than 50 grams of alcohol each day may have 2 to 3 times greater risk of developing these cancers than sober individuals. It is actually much higher for those using alcohol and tobacco in combination. Uh, Alcohol and tobacco together. Esophageal cancer. So alcohol is a risk factor for a severe form of esophageal cancer called esophageal squamous cell carcinoma, or ESCC. People without an alcohol metabolism enzyme, meaning people who can't metabolize alcohol, are at higher risk of this problem if they drink alcohol, obviously. Then there's liver cancer. While we have covered liver problems before we discuss cancer risk, alcohol is a primary cause of liver cancer as well as liver cirrhosis. And for breast cancer, a meta-analysis of 53 studies found women drinking more than 45 grams of alcohol a day were 1.5 times more likely to develop breast cancer than sober women. A study of 1 million women in the UK found 10 grams of alcohol consumed increased risk of breast cancer by 12%. And finally, there's colorectal cancer. A meta-analysis of 57 case control and cohort studies found people who drank more than 50 grams of alcohol a day were 1.5 times more likely than sober people to develop colorectal cancer. There was a 7% increase in risk for every 10 grams of alcohol you consumed. Let's talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. Fetal alcohol syndrome is the consequence of a pregnant woman drinking alcohol. There are 3 ways that alcohol can affect a baby, a fetus. The first way is when alcohol enters the bloodstream and crosses into the placenta. The second way is when alcohol completely prevents oxygen from being delivered to the baby. And the third way is when alcohol harms the growing fetus's tissues and organs and cause brain damage. There are also secondary complications such as ADHD, alcohol or drug use, early death, and mental health problems. Often pediatricians will combine these into a wide range of disorders called fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASDs. If you're concerned that your baby may have fetal alcohol syndrome, you should talk to your pediatrician. So, a note on the gender gap. So, it turns out in both developed and emerging economies, fewer women die of alcohol use than men. As you can see here. In China, with 650,000 male deaths, 59,000 female. In India, 290,000 male deaths, 42,000 female deaths. In developing countries, in the United States, 71,000 for males, 19,000 for females. In France, 37,800 for men and 14,000 for women. So you might think that females are more immune to the effects of alcohol, but that's actually not true. There are differing effects. So it turns out women have alcohol-related problems sooner and at lower levels than men. So for the same amount of alcohol that it would take for so for the same amount of alcohol that it would take for a woman to experience alcohol-related problems, a man might not experience any. Let's start off with alcohol use disorder, or AUD, a brain disorder that hampers the ability to stop drinking, even after you see consequences. So, if you're drinking and you can clearly see that you're feeling worse, alcohol use disorder would prevent you from stop drinking. You just keep drinking. Next is liver damage. While we have discussed this earlier, liver damage still occurs earlier in women who drink alcohol than in men. In addition, women are more susceptible to alcohol-related heart disease than men, and women may also suffer brain damage from drinking alcohol. We also discussed drinking alcohol and risk of breast cancer and fetal alcohol syndrome. So, considering the fact that alcohol is this bad, why would anyone drink? Well, people generally drink to socialize or to cope with stress. Other reasons include to, in the words of one paper, quote, increase power, to escape problems, for enjoyment, or for ritualistic reasons, end quote. However, most research focuses on coping and social drinking. This paper found that among 781 Michigan residents, coping or social drinking, the most common reasons, created circumstances for alcohol abuse. People who drank to cope with stress drank more when they were stressed. Young adults most strongly exemplified the relationship between heavy drinking caused by stress. So, solutions. So, because the effects of alcohol, the benefits of alcohol are far outweighed by the risks, what should schools, families, and others do? Here's what schools and educators can do. Schools can support and train teachers and actively involve family and community. Teachers can provide information on alcohol and drugs to their students and develop resistance skills and social skills in their students. They can also teach more interactively and be more involved with their students in order to prevent them from drinking underage. A kid who's happy and has an involved teacher is less likely to drink, or if they start drinking, will have assistance if necessary. What about people involved in extracurricular activities? Well, they can provide positive role modeling opportunities, or they can be positive role models themselves. They can also provide leadership opportunities for youth and healthy risk activities. Although youth love to take risks, providing environments where they can do so in a healthy way permits them to not get in trouble. What about for parents and family members? Families can work to improve parent-child relations and use discipline instead of punishment. So let's say that you catch kids stealing something. Punishment would be timeout. Discipline would be to explain to them why it's wrong and to say, yeah, so it's to explain to them why it's wrong and do something about it and help them to fix their behavior. Monitoring adolescents and strengthening family bonds also seems to help. Policymakers and the wider community can help as well. Community participation is recommended to solve underage drinking problems. Policymakers can raise the minimum legal drinking age, reduce commercial and social access to drinks, and cut down the economic availability of alcoholic drinks to curb underage drinking. Now, we'll talk about talking to your teen. So for any of you parents out there, you are fortunate if your teen probably tells the truth, because some teens who drink might be scared to tell you because you might react emotionally or overreact. If you find that your teen is drinking, don't get mad at them. Be calm and remind them of the facts. You could still get angry, but if you are angry, then you should express it in a calm and firm manner rather than expressing it emotionally. So here are some questions that I recommend that you ask your teenager. Have they ever been pressured to drink alcohol by anyone, despite tell you who they're interacting with? If they have, then a follow-up question you should ask them is, what did they do or say in response to the offer to drink? Did they say yes or no? If they said yes, maybe there's an underlying psychological problem that you need to ask them questions about in more detail. If they said no, they probably know that drinking is bad for them, or they simply just don't want to drink. But you should ask them still. The third question you should ask is, if you said yes, how did you feel when you drank alcohol? If you said no, then why so? If they said yes, and then you can probably understand what they think about alcohol. Was it disgusting? Was it tasty? Did they like spending time with their peers? If they said no, you might understand why. You might find out that your teenager does not want to drink or knows that things are bad. But if your teenager is unsure about whether or not they should drink alcohol because the facts tell them not to, but their peers tell them to, you should tell them the facts and the legal consequences of drinking alcohol underage and without thinking about it. So, ideal intake. Teenagers should not drink any alcohol prior to the age of 21 for legal and medical reasons. Adults should try to avoid alcohol as well, not only for positive role modeling, but also because the benefits of drinking alcohol are quite far outweighed by the risks, as far as we know. So, in summary, let's review the key concepts that we went through. So, we covered the different types of alcohols and alcoholic beverages. We also talked about the proposed health effects of those said alcoholic beverages and the health consequences of acute and chronic alcohol consumption. We also discussed the gender difference in the effects of alcohol on different people, and finally some tactics to deal with teenage alcohol consumption. So, the main idea. Alcohol addiction is a problem among teenagers, but can be prevented. So here are some resources for alcohol. So for general information, I recommend you visit the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism at niaaa.nih.gov. If you need more information about drunk driving, visit the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration's website at nhtsa.gov. If you need any help for alcohol abuse, I recommend that you visit aa.org for Alcoholics Anonymous or Al-Anon or Alateen for teenagers who are addicted to alcohol at al-anon.org. I also recommend that you talk to your physician or medical specialist, say a pediatrician, about alcohol abuse. Thank you to Slides Carnival for not only providing this very beautiful template, but also many of the icons that were used throughout this presentation. So thank you for attending. We appreciate that you came to our webinar. But wait, don't leave yet. We have a Q&A session. So please enter your questions to the YouTube chat on the right. All questions to the right of this live stream. All questions will be answered orally, and I would love to answer your questions. But there's only one condition. Please do not ask me any personal questions, as those should be asked to your doctor. Okay, so I'll give you 2 minutes to answer your questions, and then you may enter your questions, and I'll answer them. Okay. All right. Thank you. So, we're starting the Q&A session. So, the first question I received: do alcoholic beverages contain methanol? No, alcoholic beverages do not contain methanol. That's the answer. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh wait, okay. Actually, I would like to correct my answer. So, alcoholic beverages in general do not contain methanol unless your drink was spiked with it. I'm ready to accept any other questions. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh, um, alcohol does not expire. No. Please don't be ashamed to ask any. Please don't be scared to ask any question. I can answer any question, so long as it's not personal medical information. Oh yeah, and in fact, for spirits, you don't need to worry about expiry date because they get better as they age. No, the alcohol content in a beverage does not increase with age. The only way you can increase the alcohol content is by distilling or by purposely adding alcohol. Oh, so I received a question. Why is the country liquor in India more harmful than branded liquors from factories? Well, often country liquor may be contaminated or and may not be subject to the regulations of the country, but branded liquors from factories are most likely subject to regulations, so they are less likely to be harmful. That is, unless the regulations are wrong or flawed. Okay, it looks like there are no more questions. Thank you very much for everyone who attended the webinar. It was very nice presenting to you, and I hope you learned something new and had fun. And I will see you next week with the webinar on stress, depression, and anxiety. Thanks.